Good evening, everybody. We'll get started in a moment. There we go. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Politics in Prose Live. My name is Beth Wong. I'm an event coordinator at PNP, and we thank you for joining us here to celebrate the release of Scott Seligman's newest book, The Great Kosher Meat War of 1902. At any time during the event tonight, you can click on the link that I'm going to post in the chat to purchase copies of tonight's book on PNP's website. I'll remind you all that your purchases are coming to the store at a very difficult time for small businesses across the country. And in addition to growing your own library, a book sale from PNP means that we at the store are able to bring you content like this and continue doing so. We're so proud of our event program, but really without the book sales to support it, we can't continue. On a separate note, you can ask our author a question tonight by submitting it to the Q&A box below. The button for it is found at the bottom of your screen. Make sure you are submitting your question in the Q&A and not in the chat to make sure the author and I see it. I will waste no more time getting to the main event. Scott D. Seligman is a writer and historian and author of several books, including the award-winning The Third Degree, The Triple Murder That Shook Washington and Changed American Criminal Justice, and The First Chinese American, The Remarkable Life of Wang Jinfu. His articles have appeared in the Washington Post and the Seattle Times, among other publications, and his most recent book is The Great Kosher Meat War of 1902. Scott, the floor is all yours. Welcome tonight.
Okay, let me just get the technology and see if I make sure I can share the screen properly. Let's do that from the beginning. Okay, Beth, are you seeing a slide?
I am. You're great.
Okay, we're ready to go then. Good. Well, good evening, everybody. Let me thank Beth and also Alan Watke at Politics in Prose. This is actually, I think, my third book that I have launched at Politics in Prose, and these folks have been great to work with. There's not very much good you can say about the pandemic, and nobody hopes it will be over more than I do. But one of the, I suppose, silver linings, you might say, is that these kinds of Zoom events for book talks have become very popular, and they are a way for a lot more people who would otherwise not be able to come to the store can actually enjoy the programs. So to that extent, I guess it's a good thing. And you don't have to wear a mask, which is another advantage. I will talk today for about 20 minutes or so about the book, and then I will be very happy to take any questions that you might have. Well, now, if you've ever read anything that I've written in the past, you know that almost everything I've published has had something to do with the Chinese, with China, Chinese Americans, something like that, something related to Chinese. And so writing a book about early 20th century Jewish Americans is something of a departure for me. However, this is not my first Jewish rodeo, so to speak. In addition to being a Jewish genealogist, I've created several websites and done some other writing about my family history. I've also written a couple of articles about American Jewish history for the Forward. One of them, in fact, was about, also takes place on the Lower East Side of New York, just like this book, and it was a year after this, the action in this book, was about a fundraiser put on by the Chinese community of the Lower East Side for victims of the Kishinev pogrom, which was the first pogrom in Russia of the 20th century, in which a lot of Jews died. And I called the article "The Night New York's Chinese Went Out for Jews." I'll let the title sink in for a minute. If you want to read that, just go to my website, Seligman Online, and you'll find a link to it. So I was already interested in the Lower East Side experience, both because I've written a lot about the Chinese there, and also because my own forebears, some of my own forebears, spent some time there. So I kind of focused on the Jewish experience. And the genesis of this particular work is an article that I read in the journal American Jewish History, which was written in 1980 by the late Dr. Paula Hyman, who was a professor of modern Jewish history at Yale. Dr. Hyman was the first woman to head a Jewish studies program at a major university. And I believe it was her interest in feminism and female empowerment that led her to look at the origins of activism among immigrant Jewish women. And it is she and not I who deserves credit for really exhuming this story from history, because it was not remembered too late into the century. Now, the main narrative of the book, which I'll talk a lot about as we progress through the talk, concerns Orthodox Jewish women, immigrants, who took to the streets of the Lower East Side to protest the rising price of kosher meat that made it unaffordable for many families. And I found this story of mostly uneducated women, immigrants who barely spoke English, discovering their collective power as consumers and finding their political voice in their new country. I thought it was an inspiration. So I wanted to do some more digging and understand a little bit more about it. My own maternal grandmother was living on Orchard Street at the time. She was 10 years old when this happened. But I think that her mother, my great-grandmother, very likely participated in this boycott. Unfortunately, she would be about 159 today, and she's not around to ask. So I simply have to take it on faith that she, like most of the other Jewish women on the Lower East Side, she probably participated as well. So I wanted to read further on the topic. But what I discovered was that no one had really dug more deeply into it than Dr. Hyman had. And she wrote 40 years ago, and she left us only 14 pages about it. So I decided to do some digging of my own, and fortunately for me, I had tools available to me that weren't available to her in 1980. Let's see. Okay, in the 4 decades since Dr. Hyman's article, vintage newspapers, not only from New York, but actually all across the country, have all gone online. And through the miracle and the magic of optical character recognition, they are keyword searchable now. So, which means that you can find articles that you could never find hunched over a microfilm reader in the Library of Congress. You just wouldn't know where to look. So I was able to search all of the major New York newspapers: the Times, the Herald, the Tribune, the Sun, the New York World, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, not to mention some important papers that were outside of New York, like the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, the St. Louis Republic, because this was in fact a national story. It was not only New York papers that covered it. And in addition to all of these, which yielded several thousand articles before I was done, I also used the tools of genealogical research to find out more about the women who led this boycott. I was able to find information through census, federal and state census returns, ship passenger manifests, naturalization records, passport records, vital records, obituaries, and even actually gravestones. And I was able to, by doing this, I was able to locate and contact descendants of some of the women who had been in the vanguard of this movement. None of them, to a person, had been aware of their great-great-grandmother's participation in it. And so I wound up telling them probably as much as they did me. And then there was the Yiddish press. Yiddish is unfortunately not one of my languages. And 3 important Yiddish papers survived for this period. The Forward was one. That was a socialist paper, as was the Arbeiter Zeitung. And then the Tageblatt, the third one here, was an Orthodox paper. And with some help, some of you here in DC might know of Dr. Miriam Isaacs, who used to teach Yiddish at the University of Maryland. She's a neighbor, and I went down to her house in Cleveland Park many, many times, and we sat together and pored over several dozen of these articles. She translated and I took notes. And I found that the Yiddish papers gave a wonderful perspective and a lot more detail in some cases about some of the women who were involved. Now, since I was researching a book and not an article, I had the luxury of asking a few questions that Dr. Hyman didn't have room for, like why the prices went up and who was responsible. And also issues of quality of the meat. Were people really getting kosher meat if they thought they were paying for it, or were there some shenanigans going on in the supply chain? The women blamed their retail butchers for the problem, but I discovered that the principal culprits for this were actually hundreds of miles away. So let me begin with the source of the problem. I want to tell you how the meat actually got to the to the New York area. And then I'll cut to the women and talk about the strike. This is 1902, excuse me. It's the era of the trusts, combinations of companies that are brought together, that come together to control markets. And you've heard of the Standard Oil Trust and the Steel Trust and the Railroad Trust, I'm sure. But there were men in Chicago with names like Swift and Armour who made up what was called the Beef Trust, sometimes referred to as the Meat Trust. And these men were conspiring to corner the American market for meat. And they did it by pressuring cattlemen to lower their prices, getting kickbacks from the railroads for shipping, controlling the supply of meat that was sent to the cities, and ultimately gouging consumers. So the price of all meat went up, but all over the country. But Orthodox Jews were hit the hardest, the observant Jews, and most of them were still in New York at this point. Now, obviously, kosher meat is more expensive. It's always been more expensive. It's more expensive today. And we understand that because there are people who are in the chain who have to supervise the ritual slaughter of and the processing of the meat. So we understand that it costs more because there are more people involved in it. But in 1902, there were other factors that made kosher meat more expensive. In the 1870s, the 1870s saw the invention of the refrigerator car. And this actually changed everything in the United States. It meant that that produce that was produced in California could be sold in New York, still fresh. Oranges from Florida could come up by train and still be basically almost as fresh as they were if you bought them in Florida. And as far as meat was concerned, it meant that processing of the meat could become more centralized and hence could become cheaper. And what that meant essentially was that a lot of the slaughtering of meat that used to take place locally in places like New York was centralized and done in Chicago. And so the cattle were slaughtered in Chicago and it was sent in the form of carcasses to the east. And you can see it in that slide, what a refrigerator car looked like. But kosher meat could not be handled this way. It had to be slaughtered locally. And the reason for that is that Jewish law forbids consumption of meat that has not been what they say koshered, which is to say soaked and salted within 72 hours of slaughter, something that was done in the home back then. And that's because it's forbidden to eat the lifeblood of the animal, and blood coagulates after 72 hours. So the cattle that was going to become kosher meat had to come from the Midwest to the East on the hoof. And you can fit a lot less cattle in a car if it's still alive. There are a lot of unusable parts that come with it. Cattle die in process. They lose weight in the process. It's a lot more expensive to send them on the hoof than it was to send carcasses. So for those reasons, kosher meat was more expensive. And then finally, there's one other reason. The Jewish law basically says that, this isn't exactly Jewish law, this is also partially custom. Only the forequarters of the cow are typically sold as kosher here in the United States. And this is based on a biblical story about Jacob wrestling with the angel, and apparently he injured his sciatic nerve. And it's a longer story than that, but basically the rear part of the cow, which could be made kosher with enough work and enough hands pulling out certain forbidden pieces of it, typically is sold as non-kosher meat. So, there were a lot of factors that went into why kosher meat was already more expensive. Once the cattle arrived in the New York area, most of them were held in pens in Jersey City, allowed to recover from the journey for a day or so. And the next step was the abattoirs of New York. There were three big ones in Manhattan that dealt in kosher slaughter in 1902. One was on the Hudson River. These two were on the East Coast, the East River. Schwartzel's and Sulzberger and United Dressed Beef. They're pictured here. That's exactly the piece of real estate on which the United Nations stands today. And these slaughterhouses were typically operated by German Jews. And German Jews were earlier immigrants. They had already been, many of them been very successful in the United States. This is Ferdinand Sulzberger, who was the president of one of them. Like the others in charge, he was not particularly Orthodox himself. And there was no real love lost between the German Jewish establishment and the Eastern European immigrants. The Eastern Europeans looked at them as, they called them Hebrews with shaved beards, or they criticized them as people who had gotten fat from eating treif, which is to say non-kosher meat. But the condescension was fairly mutual. I think the Germans looked at the Eastern European immigrants as bumpkins who were unassimilable and ultimately embarrassing to them. So it wasn't a particularly close relationship. Well, after the slaughterhouses, the meat went to the retail butchers, and most of them who dealt in kosher food were on the Lower East Side of New York. There are about 600 kosher meat retail establishments in New York at this time. So when the Midwestern cartel started to jack up the prices, and it only took a month or two for this to happen, the retail price of kosher beef went up 50%, basically the first several months of 1902. It had been 12 cents a pound. It was now 18 cents a pound. And while that doesn't sound like very much to us today, it was about 5 1/4 in today's dollars. And for families that whose breadwinners brought home maybe $10, maybe $12 a week, this was a huge rise. And from the $12, everything had to come out of that: rent, all sorts of incidental expenses and food. And so for a lot of these families, they simply weren't going to be able to afford to eat meat in the way that they had in the past. And of course, for most of them, because of the religion, buying non-kosher meat was simply unthinkable. So at the same time that all of this is going on, when New York's Jews are trying to figure out how they're going to deal with this, President Theodore Roosevelt, who was known as the Trust Buster president, was actually taking the Beef Trust to court because they were violating antitrust laws. The Sherman Antitrust Act had already passed the Congress the decade before, and there was reason to believe that they were colluding, and that was against the law. So Roosevelt took them to court. The case eventually, the case was a backdrop against which this struggle was taking place. And eventually landed the companies in the Supreme Court, which ruled against them. And eventually the cartel was in fact dismantled, but not while this strike was going on. It took a few more years after that. So now back to the main narrative, the women's boycott. When the prices rose in early 1902, the retail butchers knew that their customers would not be able to absorb a 50% increase in the price of meat. So they decided to get ahead of the problem as much as they could, and they staged a boycott of their own. They boycotted their wholesalers, which were the slaughterhouses. They closed their doors for 4 or 5 days in an effort to bring the prices down. And the women of the Lower East Side, who were their principal customers, supported them in this. Everybody was on the same team. Everybody was trying to get the prices down. And the butchers did manage to get some minor concessions from the slaughterhouses, but nothing major and nothing that really interfered with the prices that they were charging. But what happened was when the butchers reopened after 4 or 5 days, they actually began charging prices that were higher rather than lower than they had been before. And that set off the women of the Lower East Side of New York. Several women emerged from obscurity to oppose them. Now, I want to introduce you to the women, but I have to tell you that my biggest heartbreak in the whole process of researching and writing this book is that there aren't any photos of them that survive. And believe me, I've looked under rocks. I searched everywhere. I contacted descendants to try to find them. I looked in newspapers. I looked everywhere. There just aren't portrait pictures of these women anymore. But that doesn't mean that we can't paint a portrait of them. It's just, it's not going to be one that you can look at. So let's start by, I'd like to introduce you first to Sarah Edelson. She started the whole thing when she called a meeting on May 14th, 1902 at Monroe Palace, which was the name of the saloon that her family operated on Monroe Street. She expected about 50 people to show up, and they actually put an ad in one of the local Yiddish papers asking women to come and discuss the price of meat. Well, 500 people showed up, and they spilled out onto Monroe Street. Sarah was a force of nature. She was a large woman. By several sources, she weighed about 250 pounds. She was imposing. She had a booming voice that rang with authority, and she was a natural leader and really a born organizer. She had arrived in the US in 1868, which was very, very early for Russian Jews. The wave of Russian Jews of immigration didn't really start in earnest until the 1880s, but she was an early arrival. She was about 50 when this thing happened. She had already given birth to 6 children, but motherhood had never kept her homebound. She helped out at the store. She helped manage she managed the saloon. She also earned extra money as a shadchan, which was the Yiddish word for a matchmaker. She never shrank from a fight, and she was, and so she was really the match that started the flame. Next is Carolyn Schatzberg. Carolyn Schatzberg was native of Romania. She had married there. She immigrated in 1885. At the time of the strike, she was 51. She was a white-haired widow. 2 of her 7 children were still at home, but she had just lost her husband several months before this happened. She was a woman of some means. She was better off than the Edelson family was. She actually had a servant living at home. But she said that she was happy to fight for people who were less fortunate than she was. In her 18 years in America, she had mastered English. She was almost eloquent in the language. She was interviewed by a couple of newspapers, and the interviews survive. She eventually took over leadership of the movement, but not without a fight from Sarah Edelson. Next was Paulina Finkel. She was a 32-year-old mother of 4. She'd been in America for about a decade. It was she who placed the announcements in the Yiddish press, calling on the women to take action. And she was a member of a team that went to the mayor's office to try to get a demonstration permit and to ask that the police not interfere with the women's demonstration. Neither was successful. But the New York World referred to her as the Napoleon of the East Side. And finally, Sarah Cohen, 31 years old. She was a woman of boundless energy. She was tall, blue-eyed, fair-haired. She had immigrated from Austria at the age of 19, married a locksmith in 1894. And she had a house full of children, the youngest of whom was less than 2 months old. But that didn't stop her from becoming the proprietress of a cooperative butcher shop, which the women set up as a way to compete with their local butchers. So there's the 4 of them, but it was a 5th one, Fanny Levy, 35 years old, Russian-born mother of 6, who gets credit, in my view, for the most quotable quote in the book. At this meeting at Monroe Palace, after the butchers reopened and they had completely failed to make any headway in the prices, she called for the women to take matters in their own hands. And what she said was, "This is their strike," meaning the butchers. "Let the women make a strike, then there will be a strike." In fact, I wanted to call the book "Let the Women Make a Strike," but the publisher had other ideas. So I was content to leave it as a chapter heading. And I also have a picture here, courtesy of the Edelson family, of Monroe Palace, which is where it all happened. Sarah, unfortunately, is not in the picture, but a couple of her sons are on one end or the other. And so what happened was, the morning after this organizational meeting at Monroe Palace, literally the morning after, there was no more time than that, some 3,000 women, souls, 3,000 souls, mostly were Jewish women, who had been recruited the night before by a lot of knocking on doors that went through the tenements. They assembled in the pitch black in the wee hours of the morning in squads of 5 on every block on the Lower East Side where there was a kosher butcher shop. And when the stores opened at 7 in the morning, they waved off all the potential buyers and explained that if they worked together and did without meat for just a short period of time, prices would come down. Well, that was the plan anyway. The demonstrations were supposed to be completely nonviolent, but unfortunately they didn't stay that way. Customers who passed through their lines and insisted on patronizing the butchers were assaulted on the way out. Their purchases were grabbed from them, thrown into the gutter. In some cases, they would pour kerosene on them so they could never be eaten. Butcher shops who refused to close down, butchers who refused to close, were attacked. Their windows were smashed, their stock was ruined. In some cases, their fixtures were even destroyed. And there were even a few reports of arson. The police were summoned to the neighborhood by the hundreds, and they viciously attacked the, wait a minute, I just flipped the slide, I didn't mean to do that. They viciously attacked, excuse me, here we are. They viciously attacked the women with their nightsticks. They sent many to local hospitals and many more to jail. And all this goes on for 3 nights, 3 days and nights. And then we hit Friday night, May 16th, which is the beginning of the Jewish Sabbath, and the street protests stopped dead in their tracks. Because it's the Sabbath, and these are observant people. It was as important to observe the Sabbath as it was to eat kosher meat. But the women were not exactly idle for the Sabbath. They decided that this was their opportunity to go through to the synagogues and what they called the shtiblach, which were the small worship halls, and to plead their case with the worshipers who were mostly male. These were the husbands and the fathers who worked during the week, but on the Sabbath, they could be found in the synagogues. And there are two women in particular that the story goes. We know them today only as Mrs. Silver and Mrs. Kisselov. Their first names, unfortunately, in their biographies are lost to history. But Mrs. Silver and Mrs. Kisselov went around to these synagogues to try to build support. And in the Beis HaMidrash HaGadol, which was the largest synagogue on the Lower East Side at the time, they were received sympathetically. Mrs. Silver had a Jewish education, and she was very clever about it. She quoted Genesis. With tears in her eyes, she used God's pronouncement to Eve that God was talking about Adam to Eve, and he used the phrase, "He shall rule over thee." And she used this to appeal to the men to use their authority over the women in their houses to a good end, and urge them to avoid kosher meat for the foreseeable future until the prices came down. And apparently many of the men were receptive to the message, and they pledged to do just that. Then they visited the Eldridge Street Synagogue, which still stands today, where Mrs. Silver asked the rabbi which she said, to lay a cherem on the meat, which is a very potent Yiddish term for a boycott, that it's something in the nature of a religious ban. Well, he was unwilling to do this. He was afraid of the butchers, but he did ask the worshipers to support the boycott. And it took some persuading, but he permitted the women to speak from the bima, which was the platform in the center of the synagogue where the Torah is traditionally read, and which is traditionally off limits to women. In these Orthodox synagogues, the women sat either on the other side of a divider or up in a balcony, and they were not on the main floor, and they certainly weren't on the platform. But the women were taking advantage of a little used and little understood Jewish custom that dates back something in the 12th century. It's called betul hatamid in Hebrew. I'm not sure how to say it in Yiddish, that permitted someone to interrupt services and even interrupt the Torah reading to seek the redress of a wrong in a matter of social justice. And the women basically called on this because, again, their backs were against the wall. This was a battle that simply had to be won. Well, things didn't go so well at the Forsyth Street Synagogue. I don't have a picture of that one, where a very vocal worshiper objected to them mounting the bima. He called it chutzpah, which I'm sure everybody understands, and that it was an insult to the Torah for a woman to be on the platform. And Mrs. Silver didn't miss a beat. She just shot back, "The Torah will forgive me," and they continued to speak. But she and Mrs. Kisselov narrowly escaped arrest in this particular synagogue. Well, that was the Eldridge Street. Oh, here we go. So at a meeting the next day, they formed an organization called the Ladies Anti-Beef Trust Association. And this was established to lead the boycott. Among other things, it printed and distributed Yiddish language circulars to the tenements to build support. One of them read, "Eat no meat while the trust is taking the meat from the bones of your women and children." And this organization, the Ladies Anti-Beef Trust Association, recruited like-minded women outside of Manhattan as well to organize local committees, reached out to the synagogues, to the benevolent societies, and the lodges in the Jewish quarter to try to build support. And over the next week, the boycott spread. It spread to Brooklyn, to the Bronx, to Harlem, across the river to Newark, and even Boston. Well, the next day they were back on the streets, and the demonstrations continued for several days until all the butcher shops had either closed or had them closed for them. And this is an illustration from the front page of the Forward on May 17th. It shows a Jewish man being crushed by a joint effort of the Meat Trust, which is represented by a large steer on the left. Those are the folks in Chicago. And the Kosher Meat Trust, which were their local butchers, symbolized by a shochet, which was a slaughterer. Well, now, one of the things that struck me as very interesting was the blame game, and how everybody who was upset about this managed to affix blame just one step earlier than they were on the supply chain. Let me explain that. So you start with the women. the women blamed their local butchers for the rise in prices. And the butchers, in turn, blamed these German Jewish-run slaughterhouses, the operators who claimed that they were powerless to set prices, but they actually had a certain amount of sway over them. These guys insisted that the prices were dictated by these meat packers in Chicago. And the meat packers blamed the cattlemen. They said, no, the real problem is that there aren't enough cattle and that's why the prices are going up. Well, in fact, it was these meat packers who were mostly responsible for manipulating the prices. But the local scene in New York pitted Jew against Jew, housewives against butchers, butchers against wholesalers, secular against the Orthodox, Eastern European Jews against German Jews. And it also exacerbated other conflicts like that between the Jews and the police. There was no love lost between the Jews and the police during this period. The police were very active in trying to suppress unionization and labor strikes as well. And a lot of Jews got beaten by the police even before this thing happened. Before long, every kosher butcher shop on the Lower East Side was closed. And the newspapers were sympathetic with the demonstrators up to a point. This is the foreword. The headline in the foreword is "Brava, brava Jewish women." They were totally supportive of this. This is a socialist paper. Anything that kind of got back at the capitalist establishment was fine with them. The New York World was also supportive. It compared the whole affair to the Boston Tea Party. And it said that it's impossible not to feel a touch of patriotic sympathy for the East Side housewives. Not so the New York Times. It will not do to have a swarm of ignorant and infuriated women going about any part of the city with petroleum, destroying goods and trying to set fire to the shops of those against whom they're angry. Now remember, the Times was owned by German Jews, and it didn't need much persuading to condemn the protesters. It called them ignorant. It referred to them as a dangerous class of people who do not understand the duties and the rights of Americans. Well, it was probably inevitable that some control over this boycott would eventually pass into the hands of men. After all, to build support, the women had to reach out to many organizations that were male-dominated. It also didn't sit well with the men folk to see their women being beaten in the streets by the police. And it was the men who had the most experience dealing with issues that transcended the Jewish community. Because up until this point, there was not much of a role for these Jewish immigrant housewives outside of their milieu, which was mostly the household. Now that changed, and it didn't take too much longer for it to change. But in 1902, it was still more or less the rule rather than the exception that women would be out in the community doing any kinds of organization. So men like Dr. David Blaustein, who was superintendent of the Educational Alliance, which was a settlement house on the Lower East Side for Eastern European Jews, organized by German Jews, by the way. And then there was another man named Joseph Barondis, who was a labor activist. And these two men soon became part of the leadership of the movement. And very shortly after their entry, a larger coalition was organized. And it was called the Allied Conference for Cheap Kosher Meat. Note that this name made no reference to women, because by this time, it wasn't just a women's movement anymore. And this male-dominated committee eventually was calling the shots. But interestingly, it does not appear as if the women objected to this appropriation of power. And we can talk a little bit about that in the Q&A if you want to. But the way I look at it is that this wasn't foremost a feminist organization, feminist movement. The women weren't looking for more power for women. They were looking for cheaper kosher meat. And whoever was able to help them do that was fine with them, including men. So there was a little bit of schism in the movement later on at the end of it, but by and large, people worked together, and there wasn't a lot of resentment or any really calling out of gender as an issue. Now, how the boycott ended is complicated. It was with more of a whimper than a bang. You can read the book for how it wound down, but suffice it to say that there were lengthy negotiations with the wholesalers, the rabbis got involved, and the slaughterhouses and the meat packers ultimately gave in because, after all, their goal had been to maximize profits and make more money. And if nobody was buying meat, they weren't making any money. So it really had backfired on them. So prices did come down for a while, and the strike has to be said that the strike was a success, but a sort of a limited one. Limited because prices rose again. They rose in 1908, they rose in 1917, they rose again during the Depression. And there were demonstrations each time on the streets, but nothing on the scale of the 1902 boycott. This was the high watermark for activism. What I found most compelling was that without prior experience, with minimal resources, and with almost no time, these women managed to organize themselves virtually overnight into a powerful fighting force that was successful in challenging very well-funded, vested corporate interests. They emerged from obscurity to do it, and they sank right back into obscurity when it was all over. But they were trailblazers. This was the vanguard of homemaker-organized Jewish activism in America. And we saw the same strategies used in the rent strikes that took place in 1904, 1908. The 1902 meat strike was explicitly called out as a precedent, and they borrowed tactics like leafleting, street meetings, and other forms of community organizing were copied. And then tenant strikes, interestingly enough, were also female-led, but it was an entirely different group of women. So after the kosher meat war was over, immigrant Jewish women didn't need any more persuading that they were capable of uniting and affecting change in their new homeland. And we did see the same tactics used in suffrage demonstrations and in labor actions that happened later on in the decade. The memory of this probably lasted maybe 10, 15 years, something like that. After the Depression, nobody talked about the 1902 strike, and it really was kind of lost to history until Dr. Hyman rediscovered it. But I think that it's fair to say that even if it itself was not remembered, its influence could be felt straight through the 20th century. Whenever consumers united to protest an objectionable corporate policy or a lapse in ethical behavior, or as in 1902, an unwelcome rise in prices. And I think we still owe them a debt and we stand on their shoulders when these things happen. But let me stop here. This is not a traditional book talk, so I can't exactly sign copies. But what I can do, let me, am I back now? Let's see.
Yes, you're back.
I'm back. Okay, good. I can't see me, but I get that. Let's see. Am I still back? Uh-oh. What did I do?
Yes, you are. You are. No, you're good.
I'm still here. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
What I can do as far as if you want to buy a book and have it signed, what authors are doing these days is we're signing labels. So if you have a copy and you want it to be inscribed to somebody, send me an email. You can get it. Just go to greatkoshermeatwar.com. And you'll be able to send me an email and let me know what you want me to put on it. Give me an address and I'll write out a label and I'll be happy to send it to you. But now I would love to take your questions if you have some.
All right, let's do this Q&A. I just put the greatkoshermeatwar.com address in the chat alongside the book link. So definitely utilize that link and get your book plate. Okay, so we have a lot of great questions. The first one is from Barbara Berman. She asks, you said that there were 600 kosher meat stores in 1902. Do you know how many there are in 2021?
That's an easy answer, Barbara. No. I don't keep kosher myself, and I live in New York. I really don't have any idea. Sorry.
P. Baldinger.
That must be Pam Baldinger. Hi, Pam.
Asks, were there any repercussions of the strike in the non-Jewish, non-kosher community of New York?
Not that I really saw. There was dissatisfaction with the price of meat outside of the Jewish community as well. And there were discussions. Every so often somebody would say, well, we're too dependent on on this Midwestern cartel. We should be buying our own cattle from the West. We should be, et cetera, et cetera. But nothing really came of it. As far as I know, not. And interestingly enough, Pam, there weren't even repercussions with the stores next door to the butcher shops. And this is one of the reasons I think it was I would say that despite the violence, this was really a very well-disciplined movement. First of all, you saw women stop dead in their tracks when the Sabbath started. Nobody was demonstrating on the Sabbath. Secondly, unlike a lot of other urban riots where whole streets are laid waste, they targeted the butcher shops and to a much lesser extent the restaurants but nobody else really got their ox gored by this. Also, the third thing I would cite is that the women, when they seized meat from somebody else, sometimes they would reach into their purses and try to find the money to reimburse the person who had bought the meat. But in pouring kerosene on it, they had a particular motive. Nobody enjoyed the meat. It wasn't like, well, I took it from you and I took it home and I secretly had a steak. That wasn't done. They really understood that they needed to work together for it. So I think it was pretty well disciplined. But to get back to your question, I don't really think it was a, it spilled over outside of the Jewish community, this particular thing.
Fabulous. Judy Schatz has a very interesting question. Did secular Jews play any part in this as a social justice issue? And says, my grandfather made a reference to the meat trust in a 1912 letter to my grandmother.
Yeah, there still was a meat trust in 1912. It took a while for it to kind of wind down. The answer is yes. The women reached out to groups that were not, first of all, that were not Orthodox. And also a lot of them that were not even Jewish or not entirely Jewish. They reached out to the labor unions. The Forward, a good example, the Forward was socialist. They were more interested in the political issue than they were in the quality of the meat. A lot of non-practicing Jews or at least non-kosher Jews were approached and generally very supportive. The ones who were not, interestingly enough, were the uptown Jews. The German Jews and the earlier Sephardic Jews that arrived, they were embarrassed by this. These were people who had arrived much earlier, had assimilated, and earned a certain measure of acceptance by Gentiles. And they saw this going on the Lower East Side. They were terrified it was going to reflect badly on them, that these immigrants from Russia wouldn't obey the law. So there wasn't a lot of sympathy there. But among the non-practicing socialist Jews, the other Russian Jews, there was a lot of support.
Awesome. A couple of questions that are related to each other. Richard Jaff asks, and you touched on this a bit, but what did their husbands think of all their activity? Besides helping to save money, were they supportive overall? And then a similar question, what was kind of, and you also went into this, but what was the broader public perception of the women organizers at this time? And did any of the women go on to organize or help with any other collective action afterwards?
Well, the husbands were pretty upset by this. In some cases, the women who were arrested were taken right to jail, leaving children home alone. But the men were working most of the time during the day. In fact, the first couple of nights when women were kept in jail, a lot of the husbands went to the police station and demanded that their women be released. And some of them even attacked a couple of policemen to try to get it to happen. But the husbands were supportive. Yes, there was no real issue with that. And then the second part of the other question, you scrolled through too fast. It was about.
Sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
Let me.
Can we go back to the last question?
Yeah. What was the public perception of these women organizers at the time? Did any of the women go on to organize any other
yes.
collective action afterwards?
And the answer to the second question there is absolutely not. These were women who emerged from obscurity and went right back into obscurity when they were over. I only even found an obituary for one of them. They were simply the people who were at the right place at the right time with the right set of skills. And even in the later meat boycotts and in the tenant strikes, which were female run, not these women. We never heard from them again. I think one of them did do was a little bit active in, I think it was Sarah Cohen, in labor issues later on, but basically no. And that's one of the things that's sort of marvelous about them. You know, they were at the ready when they needed to be, and then they went back to their lives.
Great. Two other questions about your kind of the conception of this book and your process. Apologies as I joined late. Can you talk about how you came across this topic and were inspired to write a whole book on it? And then how did you become interested in this, and how do you conduct your research?
Well, I explained earlier, I became interested in it. Most of my work has been about Chinese on the Lower East Side, but I also have my own ancestors some of them were on the Lower East Side as well. And I've always been interested in that. I first came across an article about this that was written in 1980, and I decided I wanted to dig a little bit more deeply about it. So that's how I started. And the research was mostly primary sources. Mostly it was old newspapers in both English and Yiddish, but I also looked at a lot of the genealogical resources, the passenger records and the census records and things like that. And I used the genealogical skills to find and contact descendants and get stories and photographs and things from the descendants as well. So that's kind of how I pulled it all together. The truth is there wasn't that much to find. You know, because these women were obscure, I really had to look under rocks for any real facts about them. But fortunately, two of the women who were in the leadership, Carolyn Schatzberg and Sarah Edelson, they were both interviewed extensively by the New York World. And I learned a lot about them from that and also from their descriptions in the Yiddish newspapers. So that's kind of how I did it.
Fabulous. Jan Hurwitz asked,
Hi, Jan.
And this is a nice transition. Have the ladies' descendants engaged in such important activism? Was there a genetic or cultural influence upon future generations?
Yes, and in some cases there were. These were bright people who were active in their societies and in their cultures. Different kinds of things in different families and stuff. But there were several prominent people among their descendants. Let's say that.
Fabulous. Roland Fry asks,
Hi, Roland.
what, if any, was the involvement and reaction of the New York WASP establishment?
Well, really, I think we get that mostly from the newspapers, from how the editorials in the newspapers, and also an occasional letter to the editor and things like that. In general, I would say that especially at the beginning of the boycott, there was a fair amount of sympathy for the women. People understood that their backs were against the wall and that it was a matter of orthodoxy, a matter of their religion, that they really couldn't adjust and simply buy cheaper meat someplace else. But as the boycott progressed and as the violence continued, sympathy kind of waned, I think, for some of the women. And you saw it most clearly in that New York Times article. It will not do to have a bunch of marauding women, running around New York. Of course, it was German Jewish run, and they had an axe to grind. But still, in all, I think there was less sympathy the longer that the strike went on.
All right. Beatrice Camp would like to know, what topics are you researching now, and will there be any follow-up to this?
Are you a ringer bee? This is for my commercial for my next book. I have another book in process. It's a book about and it's not about a Jewish topic. It's not about a Chinese topic. It'll come out in the fall of this year. And it's the story of a murder, actually, the murder of a pregnant white woman in Annapolis in 1917, for which a black man was, of which a black man was accused and for which he was hanged. Based on circumstantial evidence. A lot of the community felt that he was not the murderer. And in 80-something years later, I think it was in 2002, he was given a posthumous pardon by the governor of Maryland. So I looked at that whole issue, and I've written a book. Basically, it's kind of an argument for posthumous pardons as one factor in making amends for past racial injustices that were committed against people by the court system and by the judicial system generally. Thanks, B.
And I'm sure we'll be excited to have that one at Politics and Prose.
Thank you. Is that an invitation? I'll accept.
Sure. Bonnie Casper says, Scott, did any of the local politicians take sides or get involved in this issue, or was it seen as more of a cultural issue that I guess they didn't get involved in?
No, they did get involved. The women went right to the city attorney, and the mayor actually got involved as well. The mayor at this point was one of the rare intervals when Tammany Hall was not in control of New York, and the mayor was a reformer, and the only way he had gotten elected was with a lot of Jewish support, and so he was actually involved in the book in several cases. Once when it looked as if the calendar was such that the calendar of when Passover showed up that year was going to make it very, very difficult for Jews to buy meat because of blue laws that forbade the butcher shops be open on Sundays, and religious laws that forbade them from being open on Saturdays. And the mayor intervened and basically told the police not to enforce the state law to allow the kosher butchers to sell on Sunday. But he was more involved on something that happened later, right after the kosher meat war, when with the death of the chief rabbi of New York, which is a major story in the book, but I haven't talked about it tonight. It gave rise to what I believe was the single largest incident of anti-Semitic violence that New York City has ever seen. And a lot of people were beaten by the police, and the Jewish community demanded an investigation into it, and the mayor was right up there along with them. So yes, this was a time that the Jews did have some friends in the political firmament and that they could call on. Something interesting enough that the Chinese didn't have. That's one of the reasons I think that the Chinese, I was mentioning at the beginning of the talk, were involved in trying to help the Jewish community with the Kishinev pogrom. They were very interested in how the Jews had done it, how as another immigrant group they had become politically active and politically powerful.
Jerry Ostrover asks, Isaac Gellis was one of the original members of the Eldridge Street Synagogue. What was his reaction to the boycott?
I haven't the slightest idea, Jerry.
Okay.
The truth is, at the Eldridge Street Synagogue, we did look in the minutes books there. This particular incident wasn't actually mentioned, but the next day there was a meeting, and they said they were going to join a coalition of synagogues to discuss kosher meat issues, but that's all we know. And Isaac, that's not a name that I know, I'm afraid.
Got it. Someone asks, was there fear of government or law intervention given their treatment in Europe?
Well, I think so. Like I said, the relationship between the Jews and the police was fraught during this period. They didn't look at the police as helpful. They looked at the police really as oppressors, and they had a lot of reason to do that. But it didn't stop them from going to the mayor's office to try to get a demonstration for a permit, or go and they met with the chief of police to try to ask him for the police to kind of lay off them. So it did not stop them from going to the authorities and asking for help, which is something that they really couldn't have done probably in Russia or in Poland. So they accepted, and this was they were adapting to their new culture, their new country, and there were things about the new experience that were quite novel for them, having come out of the situation that they did in Eastern Europe.
There are a few questions left, and I believe we'll be able to get to them all. Carol Rosenblatt asks, do you have any idea whether the women who worked in sweatshops, I guess in New York at the time, were involved in this?
Hi, Carol. Well, what Paula Hyman said was that the women who were working in the sweatshops in 1902 were mostly the daughters of these women. They were the younger ones. Most of these women who were in their 40s and 50s weren't going out of the home. They were doing some work, I think, at home, but it was their daughters who were in the sweatshops. And in a couple of years later, during some of the tenant strikes, some of the women who emerged to lead those strikes actually were working in sweatshops. What I think was most interesting was that they borrowed not only tactics, but terminology from the unionization movement, from the labor movement. They didn't call this a boycott, they called it a strike. And women who crossed the lines to go buy meat when they weren't supposed to were called scabs. So they borrowed terminology from the labor union, because the labor unions, from the labor movement, because they understood that. And they saw themselves really as aligned with it. And so, by the way, did the Forward. The Forward was explicit in saying that, that this was the genesis of this movement, was what the Jews had learned earlier on in the labor movement. But most of the victories for the labor movement were still going to be after this. This is 1902. It's still pretty early.
Okay. Marcia Waldstreicher asks, have you found any information about the poultry war in 1928 and the antitrust case against the kingpin of chicken pullers, Charles Herbert?
No, but it sounds really interesting. Is there a book about it, or could I write it?
I think we'll have to look more into that. Barbara Levin would like you to know that she read the book and enjoyed it.
Thank you, Barbara.
She says, I think it was amazing that these women who could hardly speak English were able to gather hundreds of women to attend a meeting and activate them, which I definitely agree.
I agree with that. Of course, the lingua franca on the Lower East Side was Yiddish. Even the Jews who came from German-speaking lands of Eastern Europe, like parts of Austria and Hungary, they learned Yiddish pretty fast. And the Yiddish newspapers were dailies, and there was a lot of information that was disseminated through that. But at the end of the day, you needed English to really do a lot in the United States, and these women were up to the task. It really was quite marvelous.
Certainly. And this last question, and I'll thank you ahead of time, Scott, for one of the most efficient Q&As I've run in a while.
Just kind of batting them out there, huh?
Yeah. Judy Schatz would like to know if you have a mailing list or anywhere people can follow your work.
Well, let's see. I've got a page on Facebook, an author page on Facebook. I'm on Twitter, but I don't tweet, so that's not going to help. Judy, send me an email through the website, greatkoshermeatwar.com, and I'll put you on the mailing list for next time I have a book that comes out. Okay, be happy to do that. That's true, anybody. And if you need a signature for a label or something, write me through the website, and I'll get something in the mail to you.
Fabulous. And so that is our program for this evening. Scott, thank you so much for joining us. And thanks to our audience out there as well. This has been a really, really excellent book talk, and hopefully we'll be able to host you for the next one in person and see everybody here as well. I'll remind everybody that right now in the chat, there is a link to buy The Great Kosher Meat War of 1902 from Politics in Prose, as well as the link to Scott's greatkoshermeatwar.com, where you can request a signed label for that. Again, thank you so much for being here tonight. Without these book sales and attendance at these events, Politics in Prose does not hold the place that we are proud to in our community. So thank you very much for supporting us like that this evening.
And thanks to everybody for tuning in tonight.
Definitely. Scott, thank you. And to everybody out there, stay very well, stay safe, and stay well read. We'll see you next time.